So I celebrated my 49th birthday for the second year in a row. For about 30 of those past birthdays, I've been a collector. Not of coins or stamps or rare books, but a collector of words. Word collecting has great advantages over other kinds of collecting. It's inexpensive, and the supply is virtually inexhaustible. Because if there's one thing the English language is loaded with, it's words. There are at least 20 words for every definition. For instance, I'm talking to you right now, but I'm also saying, speaking, orating, articulating, expostulating. Well, I won't go through the whole list, or I'd probably end up soliloquizing. In addition to native words, the English language has a long time tradition of swiping words from other languages. French has been particularly subject to these piratical excursions. Well, just think, for example, that you couldn't give a girl a bouquet, treat her at a restaurant, and then take her to a discotheque if it weren't for the French language. You'd have to spend the whole evening in English. It got so bad that the French government finally founded a whole intelligence agency whose sole function was to guard French words from being smuggled out of the country. You may recall the notorious scandal back in the 50s when a member of the Académie Française was jailed for selling the word détente to an American political candidate. Since that time, woe be to the tourist going through French customs found with a French idiom concealed in his suitcase. Due to this tightening of French security, we've had to take to stealing words from Spanish. Consider the popularity of the word macho, for instance. Macho, which my wife once described as defining sheep in wolves' clothing. Now, as a patriotic word collector, I am appalled by this filching from other languages, particularly because there are so many marvelous words in English that nobody ever uses. As a public service, I have taken some of the more interesting of these words from my collection, dusted them off, and I'm here this evening to present them for your inspection. I've divided them into 4 categories: words with very specialized meanings, short words that say a lot, what I call gammon words, which I'll explain when I get to, and finally, simply fun words. Beginning with the specialized words, we first have pleonosis. Now, pleonosis is a condition that is a very familiar one to us all. It is having an exaggerated sense of one's own importance. In other words, the person with pleonosis is a person who's laboring under the delusion that he's as important as we are. I'm sure if you give it some thought, you can probably think right at this moment of some people with this affliction. A person with pleonosis almost begs to be deflated. And one of the best ways to do that is with an asteism. Now, an asteism might be described as being a gentleman's insult, bearing in mind Oscar Wilde's definition of a gentleman as someone who is never rude unintentionally. A master of the art of asteism was the 19th century English clergyman and wit Sir Sidney Smith. Once the Reverend Smith was confronted by a pompous businessman who was intent on putting this minister in his place by saying, "Sir, if I had a son who was a fool, I'd put him in the church." "Well," said Reverend Smith, "we in the church are certainly most grateful your father didn't feel that way." This next word also describes an expression, and I would want to reassure anyone here who might be a graduate of Occidental College that this word, despite the way it looks, is not oxymoron. It is oxymoron. Now, an oxymoron is a phrase that's made up of 2 contradictory words, such as an asteism is a polite insult, or she did him a cruel kindness, or he worked for military intelligence. You get the idea. Next we have anaxophilia. Now, anaxophilia is a condition that will be very familiar to anyone who has ever had a teenage daughter. Anaxophilia means the tendency to fall in love with jerks. I'm afraid I can't tell you what to do for it, but at least now you know the word for it. Gynatocolobomasophile. I don't wish to alarm anyone in the audience, but I would wager that we have at this moment in this assemblage one or possibly more gynatocolobomasophiles. For you see, the secret of a gynatocolobomasophile is that it's someone who loves secretly to nibble on women's earlobes. These next two words, catapolysis and omphaloskepsis, might be said to be described two opposite schools of thought in how to deal with a crisis situation. Catapolysis might be thought of as the more direct, assertive, perhaps occidental way of dealing with a crisis situation, of problem solving. It means blowing off steam by swearing your head off. Omphaloskepsis, on the other hand, might be considered a more oriental method. It is a form of meditation, and I believe vastly superior to transcendental meditation or yoga. I myself have found some of my most creative work done under the influence of omphaloskepsis. Long Sunday afternoons I have spent practicing it. Omphaloskepsis means to think about nothing while staring at your navel. These next three words describe forms of government. An androcracy is a government ruled by men, or, if you will, government by chauvinist male pigs. However, to redress the balance, we have a gynarchy, which is a government ruled by women. There are a lot of these words that describe governments. Plutocracy, which is a government run by the wealthy, a mobocracy, a government run by the mob, a technocracy, a government run by technicians. But somehow or other, with all these choices, we always seem to end up with a boobocracy, which, as you might have guessed, is a government run by boobs. Last of all is my favorite long word, hippopotamonstrosesquipedal. Now, a hippopotamonstrosesquipedal is not a hippopotamus-like animal with 6 feet. It is simply a very long word for any very long word. Departing now from our hippopotamonstrosesquipedalian discourse, let us consider very short words. Here is bumph. Bumph refers to paperwork. And to get the idea of the kind of spirit bumph is used in, I might explain that its source is a shortened form of a Cockney expression which means toilet paper. Fard, despite its sound, is a perfectly respectable word which means to gloss over or to diminish the importance of something. If you ever found yourself in one of those situations where you've been had forms thrust at you by some bureaucrat to be filled out in triplicate, you might find it, you get a certain relief of your frustration by saying to him, fard your bump. The word spang is a marvelous little word. It means being directly to the point of something, right on the nose. I like it because it sounds like an arrow hitting a bullseye. Spang! Using it clears up the sinuses, too. Wouldn't it be refreshing, instead of hearing this tiresome, all right, all the time, if somebody were to say instead, spang? Geck is anything that's an object of scorn. About this next word, I have some good news and some bad news for the ladies in the audience. The good news is that the word slob cannot be applied to a woman. Slob is an exclusively male expression. The bad news is that there is a word for a female slob, and that's mab. I suppose if a mab were to marry a slob, their offspring would be a slab. Groak perhaps takes the prize for saying a lot in a short word. The word groak means to stand silently watching other people eating in the vain hope of being asked to join them. This word shank is a word that certainly could get a lot of use in our society. It means to pour a drink for somebody. You have to be a little careful about how you use it, however. I remember at a party once, in all innocence, I approached an attractive young lady and said, "May I shank you?" And she slapped my face. Next we have glyph, which is a fleeting glance, trick, sudden fright, gam, which is a pleasant and friendly talk, flam, which means anything that's humbug or nonsense, and bam, which means to play a trick on someone. Now, it seems to me that these words have a real place in our literature. I don't know how you feel about it, but every time I've read about a bestseller that I think I'd like to read, I go to look at it on the shelf, and I immediately become intimidated because it seems to be roughly the size of the unabridged Oxford Dictionary. I can remember when a bestseller was a book that was hard to put down. Now it's a book that's hard to pick up. Certainly, the excess verbiage of these works could be eliminated by the use of some of these short, to-the-point words that I've suggested. Not only would it make them easier to read and take a lot less of your time, but the mere saving of paper would be a boon to our whole forest preservation industry. Let me give you an example of how that would work. I have a passage from one of these current novels, and it goes like this. She had but rested her eyes upon him for a brief moment, but even in that short length of time, a chill of sheer terror had begun coursing itself up her spine. Now, what does all that really say? One glyph and she shrieked. Or take this passage, where a virtuous young heroine is confronting the lecherous nobleman. She says, and I quote, "The words that you have said to me are mere shallow pretense and despicable nonsense, Sir Samuel. If you attempt once more to deceive me in this manner, I will have no alternative but to depart from your presence with unceremonious haste." Now that whole long passage, with the use of some of my nice short words, could be reduced to this. Your sham gam's a damn flam, Sam. If you bam, I'll scram. It may be argued that the use of some of these words might create a little problem in intelligibility, but that brings me to my next group of words, gammon words. Now, the word gammon means anything that's said with the express intent of deceiving. I'm sure we have all known certain situations where it was a positive advantage not to be quite understood. There's an interesting human trait that when we hear a word in conversation, rather than stopping and finding out what that word means, if we don't understand it, we'll pretend that we do understand and try to guess at it by the way it sounds and the context it's used in. The way I became really aware of this was once after I'd given a speech, I asked a friend of mine how he had liked it. He said, well, I think it was certainly Aeolistic, and I would say that your eloquence was possibly Aeonian. Well, naturally I was walking on air until I made the error of going to the dictionary and finding out that what he had really said to me was that my pompous and long-winded discourse seemed like it would never end. It occurred to me then what a use words like this could have. Take the word aleatory, for instance, which means anything connected with luck, that is gambling. Now, I know somebody for a fact who for years has claimed a sizable deduction on his income tax for what he lists as aleatory liabilities. Or the word dysania. Suppose you called up at work one morning and said, "I'm afraid I'm going to be late this morning. I had an awful attack of dysania this morning." When you finally do come into work, your coworkers will look at you with great looks of commiseration and sympathy. They'll be saying to themselves, "There he goes, overcoming his dysania attack to see it through for one more day. What a trooper." Now, why should anybody ever find out that dysania means having trouble getting up in the morning? Or, if you have ever been caught in a closed situation like an elevator or a car with somebody who was smoking and it was bothering you, and you ask them very politely, "The smoke bothers me. Would you please put out your cigarette?" And they look at you as if you just asked them to chop off their right hand and continue smoking. Try this. Instead, say to them, "Excuse me, I don't like to bother you, but the smoke, I'm achypnotic, you know." Well, rather than risk the possibility of you immediately collapsing at his feet in an achypnotic fit, the person will undoubtedly put out his cigarette or cigar. You're not going to tell him that achypnotic merely means somebody who doesn't smoke. Or suppose a friend comes up to you with some idea of his and says, "What do you think of it?" And the idea is really laughable. Now you have two choices. Either you can say as much to him and lose his friendship, or you can lie to him, tell him it's a wonderful idea, and lose your self-respect. Gammon words give you the chance to escape this difficulty. You merely have to say to him, "I am really impressed with the risibility of that proposal." And if you feel constrained at calling somebody a notorious liar, how much nicer to simply refer to them as a renowned pseudologist. If any of your wives, or any of you ladies in the company, have been caught with unexpected dinner guests, fix réchauffé for them. They'll be impressed by your quick ability to whip up high French cuisine. They'll be going home to and telling people what a wonderful cook you are, and all the time réchauffé being leftovers. Now, I can see a particular business application of gammon words. Let me ask you, what is the one thing that makes an employee feel better about his job than anything else? Well, let me put that another way. What's the cheapest thing you can do that will make an employee feel good about his job? Give him an impressive-sounding job title. There are so many jobs that there are words for that sound so much more impressive than the normal word. For instance, anybody can be a secretary. But think how much distinction it evokes to be an amanuensis. Or think what it would do for your bookkeeper's feeling of self-respect to refer to him as a microeconomist. Even the office trainee, the bottom rung on the ladder, who is usually ashamed to tell anybody what his job title is, will go around proudly boasting, "Hey, I'm the office tyro." And even further than that, a really imaginative personnel department would be able to put words together and create new job titles. For instance, take the word permutations, which means the order in which things are put, and the word systematics, which is merely following a system. Put them together, your file clerk has become a permutation systematist. Or metrology, which is the science of weighing things, and agglutination, which means fastening things together. Combine these terms, and your mail clerk becomes a metrologist agglutinator. Even the bus driver can become an anthropic metatheist, since anthropic is anything to do with people, and metatheism is the moving of things from one place to another. The only problem I can see with this is that possibly the Brotherhood of Anthropic Metatheists might feel they should receive greater salaries than mere bus drivers. Finally, we come to the fun words. It's a fact that there are certain words in the language that apparently came into the language as a joke. For instance, there is a word that means someone who is equally attracted to members of either sex, and the word is ambisextrous. Or the telling of anecdotes is anecdotage. Doesn't that seem to beg for describing somebody who bores everybody with telling them about the stories of their youth as being in their anecdotage? There are words that are put together from other words. I guess the first person to do this was Lewis Carroll. He called them portmanteau words, taking part of one word and part of another word and packing them closely together to make a new word. Lewis Carroll is responsible for the word chortle, which is a cross between a chuckle and a snort. Perhaps the most familiar of these words to us is smog, smoke and fog. There's mingy, which is mean and stingy, and flimsy, which is slender and flimsy. There's faffle, which means to talk incoherently, foodle, which means to do something foolish, and foozle, which means to make an absolute mess of everything. There's an old adage among public speakers that he who faffles and foodles, foozles. Then there's ugglesome, which means something that's frighteningly ugly. These next 5 words are mump, which is somebody who, whenever they don't get their way, becomes very grouchy and pouty. Grinnesog, which is somebody who smiles all the time. Tergificator, I get it. Tergificator, which is somebody who seems absolutely incapable of making a clear-cut statement or performing a straightforward act. A snollygaster is a politician who is totally without principles of any kind. And a cockabaloo is somebody who in a position of authority becomes a bully. Now, I offer these words to anyone contemplating writing a political history of the last 20 years, because it seems to me, how beautifully do they describe our last 5 presidents. We have a mump. Before that, we had a grinnesog. And before that, a tergificator. Before that, a snollygaster. And before that, a cockabaloo. Then there's smarmy, which is somebody who is disgustingly and hypocritically obsequious and humbling. Watch out for the smarmy person, because he's very often a quidnunc. Now, a quidnunc is somebody whose whole purpose in life is to find out all the latest gossip and spread it around. Last one is a very sad and descriptive word. It describes somebody who's been stood up for a date. Now we come to some more pleasant words. Affy, which means to share a confidence with somebody. Doesn't that have a cozy kind of sound to it? Ah, yes. She and I, Affy, often. Croodle, which means to snuggle up close to somebody. And canoodle, which means to caress. There's certainly, all of us need a lot of croodling and canoodling. Now that you've had a chance to see some of these words, the question is, how do you put them into use? Well, there's nothing like the printed word. That's why I think the use of the small words in the novels could be so useful. But also, businesses can make use of them. For instance, when I spoke to the National Association of Supermarket Owners, I suggested that they put a sign in their produce department saying, "It is absolutely forbidden to thrimble here," under the theory that there's nothing that evokes as much interest in a thing to people than forbidding it to them. I was sure that they would all rush home and find out the thimble means to test fruit by pinching it. And all of you who hold in your hands the mighty transportation system of Orange County, instead of having your bus drivers saying all the time, all right, everybody move to the back of the bus, put a sign up that says, everybody, a poop of the bus. Don't you think that would cheer everybody up a lot? In fact, there's no doubt to my mind that using all these words can bring back color and poetry to the English language just when it's in danger of being swallowed up by television commercial copywriters and computer technology jargon. Don't let it happen, or we'll end up having to depend on the foreign languages completely. I hope that I've been able to entertain you with these words, and sometime I hope maybe you'll ask me back and I can bring you a whole collection of new ones. Until then, may none of you ever be forlorn. May you have all the aleatory benefices and get all the croodling and canoodling you want. Thank you.